Okay, looks like our attendee numbers are starting to kind of neutralize. So I'll just kick us off here. So hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us for our panel session at Live Well. We'll be talking today about ensuring equity in climate adaptation planning. Just some quick introductions to get familiar with everyone on the panel first. My name is Darby Berry. I am the Climate Adaptation Specialist for the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. And I'm joined today with Julia Chase, who's a Senior Environmental Planner at the City of San Diego, as well as Kelly Bray, who is the Climate Action Plan Manager for the County of San Diego. So I'm going to be talking, from all of those perspectives. And I will be kicking us off. Just as a reminder, we're going to have time at the end to do a Q&A with all the panelists. So if anything comes up for you or you have some questions, please feel free to use the Q&A chat function. We have a couple of staff from both the Climate Collaborative and the City of San Diego, both Jordan Moore and Aaron Lincoln, joining us to aid in helping ask those questions and keep them rolling. So please just throw those in there as they come to you so we can have a good, fruitful discussion at the end. Great. So like I said, my name is Darby Berry. I'm from the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. The Climate Collaborative itself, our mission is to advance climate change solutions in the San Diego region to adapt as well as mitigate the effects of climate change. By doing this, we bring together people and we envision a region that is both prosperous and resilient into the future. And we're committed to maintaining a high quality of life through a green and growing economy with an equitable and unified approach. So how we do this, we focus on sustaining regional impact, and our goals are to connect the region. So we engage with our members. We are working towards strengthening our climate resilience hub and our climate programs, which I'll touch on a little bit more, as well as leverage our collaborative capacity and also bring our members some benefits by strengthening strategic partnerships across the region. So our program, so strengthening our regional climate resilience hub, we have 4 main core areas that we work on at the Climate Collaborative. The first is focus on energy efficiency. So we've been around since 2011 and have been working on our EE program primarily since then. So this works on developing regional capacity, advancing EE work in the region. We recently completed a story map, which covers, all of the climate action plans in the region for all the different cities and what environmental and energy efficiency measures that they are taking. So really looking at connecting best practices and elevating those. We also have a coastal resilience program. We convene a sea level rise working group that meets on a quarterly basis with about 45 stakeholders from across the region, working both in planning as well as in coastal science. So tapping into our resources here where, we are located at the University of San Diego, as well as our neighboring Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So really connecting our city planners to a lot of our regional resources in that regard. We also have a climate smart water and equity program. This focuses on hosting interdisciplinary climate and water meetings. We participate as the climate change member for the San Diego Integrated Water Management Regional Advisory Committee. So, working as a region to help advance what grants and funding gets pulled into the region from a climate change lens, as well as provide technical assistance and support for our regional members. We also work on adaptation planning and regional assessment. So we host monthly meetings with our Adaptation Policy Working Group, which I'm going to dive into a little bit deeper, and is why we're all kind of here today. We're also engaged at the state level, so connecting our regional members here in San Diego to the statewide network of adaptation professionals, which is the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, as well as providing technical assistance and support and helping to elevate best practices through case studies and different projects. Our core membership, so we cover about 80% of the region geographically within our core membership. A lot of our members are focused on the cities that are here and across the region from Oceanside to Imperial Beach, as well as some of the special planning jurisdictions. So SANDAG, the Port of San Diego, and the San Diego County Regional Airport Authority. It's a really great spread of folks working in a diverse climate space here in the San Diego region, as well as those that are more focused on some conservation efforts. Recently, so one of the projects I wanted to highlight that the Climate Collaborative took part in was we recently completed a regional adaptation needs assessment. This project goals were to connect local efforts of regional adaptation to, from local efforts to regional efforts of adaptation. Wanted to incorporate adaptation into the existing planning efforts that are already underway and learn what those are, as well as identify adaptation needs as well as opportunities for the region. For this project was supported through a really strong partnership with SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments, the Tijuana River National Estuarine Resource Preserve, the San Diego Foundation, and it was funded through Caltrans SB1 planning grant. So this project consisted of 2 interview rounds. So we interviewed planners from city and regional and local governments. And in round 2, we focused on 4 climate impact areas, which is water, public health, fire, and equity. So really wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some of the other climate factors that are going to be impacting us in the San Diego region. Some of the key findings we found from this report is that data and technical assistance is one of the greatest needs for the region to start working towards climate adaptation planning. With anything, staffing and capacity, as well as funding, and funding specifically for staffing and capacity, were really strong answers. About 60% and 52% of respondents indicated that, as well as when we dove into our specific climate impact areas for round 2, that increased need for funding opportunities was even greater at 73%. One of the biggest factors that we learned as well was the lack of awareness of involvement. So what regional agencies are doing, as well as some of the local nonprofits and environmental justice organizations that we talked to for this responses. So really trying to build up that regional capacity for collaboration, as well as staffing and capacity preventing adaptation planning from getting off the ground. Some of the other really large key takeaways that we've been working towards with some of these solutions is that there's a clear definition of adaptation is lacking. And for those of you who maybe are confused about what adaptation is, I know Julia is going to dive into that a little bit deeper, but adaptation is typically defined by planning for events and shocks and stressors that are going to happen in regards to climate change, whereas mitigation is planning to reduce those shocks and stressors down the line. And so we also found out that these adaptation efforts are largely reactive. So, responding to a problem, responding to a, coastal flooding situation that happens at king tides. So different impacts that cause us to react. As well as the state policies and resources are difficult to access and or understand. So this is a newer field. So looking for best practices and guidance from the state is often something that planners were indicating was being needed. And then also, one of the reasons why we're here today is this need for enhanced regional collaboration and communication and engagement strategies and how to better elevate those across the region. One of the other big pieces that we found also related to advancing collaborative work is this funding feedback loop. So the lack of funding slows the realization to adaptation projects, meaning access to funding opportunities is a barrier, as well as accessing technical assistance needed to get projects off the ground. And then once funding is maybe obtained, that access to operationalize the funding through staffing and capacity constraints is difficult. And this creates a consistent feedback loop that's holding a lot of the region back from being able to plan for adaptation. Some of these key funding needs, like I mentioned, supporting staffing capacity within organizations, so funding specifically for staff themselves. Funding also typically targets a specific project phase, so whether it's the assessment, the planning, or implementation, or the monitoring phase, rather than holistically planning the entirety of a project. And then that other capacity aspect of it is that without the capacity, you can't pursue the funding needed to enhance your capacity afterwards. And then we also looked at prioritizing equity. So we focused on making sure that some of our interviews with stakeholders were stakeholders who work with communities of concern. And so some of those priority needs for building equity within adaptation planning is building community resilience, which requires prioritizing equity and adaptation planning from the get-go. So from stage one, incorporating equity from the basis of planning and throughout the entire planning process. So equity must be integrated and brought along, as well as a strong need for clearly defined funding for equity-specific projects within adaptation themselves. In addition to all of these needs, we also were able to identify some opportunities and low-hanging fruits for us to advance our work. So advancing regional leaders that champion projects. So there are a lot of individual practitioners who are working within their local jurisdictions or special jurisdictions to advance adaptation projects, maybe not from a holistic planning perspective, but from a project to project basis, which really does increase our regional resilience overall. Integrating adaptation into already funded multi-beneficial projects. So really figuring out what aspects of projects that you may have in the works can be integrated into your adaptation planning and making sure that we're creating those multi-benefits, as well as stronger collaboration, working to saturate the message of integration of adaptation into the planning process holistically, and enhance collaborative networks and resource sharing. As well as connecting local research to local action. So like I mentioned, we have a lot of really great research assets here in the San Diego region. So making sure that we're elevating those and elevating the access of those for all of our local cities and jurisdictions. One way at the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative that we've been able to kind of jump on some of these opportunities is through our Adaptation and Policy Working Group. So our working group is created of core members from cities, regional planning agencies, and special jurisdictions from across the San Diego region. We meet monthly, and sometimes we have presentations, from experts and best practices. It's often used for a space for sharing opportunities and cross-jurisdictional collaboration and learning. So sharing best practices, what things have worked for some cities, what haven't. Access for funding and looking for opportunities to collaborate on future funding is definitely a conversation of choice, as well as the group itself has really strong ties to the statewide collaborative, ARCA, that I have mentioned previously. So working with both the regional members here, but also with the state and looking at the state priorities and what policies are coming down the line that we can both be best prepared for. So this working group really helps to assess challenges, highlight solutions, and ultimately work towards creating a set of best practices. And so we'll hear a little bit more about that as well, but just wanted to put up some resources, and we'll link these into the Live Well portal where you can find us, the San Diego Climate Collaborative, or where you can find the regional needs assessment that I was diving into. And with that, Julia, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk from the city of San Diego's perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Darby. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Chase. I am a senior planner with the City of San Diego's Planning Department, leading our climate adaptation and resiliency planning efforts. I'm going to go over kind of the general process for developing an adaptation plan, as well as where the city's at in the process and how we've been working to incorporate equity. Next slide. So first, I wanted to start with just the distinction between adaptation and mitigation. People are typically more familiar with mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the worst potential impacts of climate change. So this is what our city climate action plan addresses through measures such as reducing car travel or increasing energy efficiency. Adaptation, on the other hand, focuses on planning for and adjusting to the environmental changes already underway. We know that even if we stopped all of our emissions today, we would still experience impacts from climate change. So adaptation really focuses on how do we minimize those impacts. Next slide. you're getting a preview of the whole show. Next is another important definition, resilience. Resilience and adaptation, sometimes that can get blurred together, but when we talk about resilience, what we're talking about is our capacity to adapt, recover, and thrive amidst a changing climate. So the difference between resilience and adaptation here is that adaptation is more directed towards preserving existing resources, while resilience is looking at the ability to emerge better. So not just to bounce back, but how do you bounce forward? Next slide. There are a few drivers to the adaptation work statewide and for the city specifically. The first is AB 691. This required all jurisdictions that had state granted lands to assess the impacts of sea level rise to these lands. So looking at changing shorelines, the impact of storms, impact to public trust resources and values, estimate financial costs around that. There's also SB 379, which requires the safety element of general plans to be reviewed and updated to include climate adaptation and resilience strategies. It requires a few things, including a vulnerability assessment that identifies the risk climate change poses to local jurisdictions, a set of adaptation resilience goals, policies, and objectives based off of the risks that were identified in the vulnerability assessment, and then feasible implementation measures to carry out these goals and policies. For the city, our climate action plan that was adopted in 2015 also identified the need for a standalone adaptation plan in strategy 5. Really looking at adaptation plan as a way to prioritize and focus our resources to take advantage of early action and take advantage of the co-benefits between adaptation and climate action work. Next slide. So when you start the adaptation planning process, you first need to know kind of what are you dealing with? What are the climate change hazards that are of concern for your jurisdiction? For the city of San Diego, this is sea level rise, extreme heat events, wildfire, flooding, and drought. Once you know that, you need to figure out what does the best available science tell us is the projections for these hazards. So for sea level rise, for example, we're using the Ocean Protection Council's projections. This allows us to also use more localized data to San Diego. We really anticipate a range of projections, especially as you go out towards the end of the century, but in general, greater frequency of coastal flooding and an increase in cliff erosion. For heat, there are multiple factors to look at, but generally speaking, a rise in daily minimum temperatures, more frequent heat waves that last longer, and an increased frequency and duration of warm nights. All of these have health impacts. When you look at warm nights, for example, these can be especially impactful to human health because it's harder for the body to cool down at night. Next slide. For wildfire, we know that climate change increases the drivers of wildfire, so higher ambient temperatures, dry conditions, more availability of fuel. So we anticipate more frequent wildfires that burn more intensely for longer, and just a longer wildfire season in general. For flooding, we already have really variable precipitation here. In Southern California, we only anticipate that to continue with more intense transitions between periods of drought and flooding, and that we will have more extreme precipitation events overall. Next slide. So now that we know kind of what the risks are and what those general projections are, we need to look at what is the vulnerability of our assets and our resources. The city considered 3 different factors when scoring vulnerability: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure is really just whether that asset is subject to harm to that climate change hazard. And then sensitivity is the degree to which it might be affected by that climate hazard. And adaptive capacity is the ability of that asset or resources to respond to that hazard. So the more sensitive an asset is, the more vulnerable it is. The more adaptive capacity an asset has, the less vulnerable it is. We also considered consequence. So a factor of risk when we are looking at scoring vulnerability, kind of you get your vulnerability score and then you say, what is the consequence of this? What does that mean if this asset is to be exposed and it is highly vulnerable? Is it a high consequential outcome, or is it something that maybe we aren't quite as concerned about? Next slide. So the city has completed 3 different vulnerability assessments. The first one was AB 691. That was to comply with AB 691. So looking at our state granted public trust lands, assessing the impacts of sea level rise to those lands. We also completed a separate sea level rise vulnerability assessment that looked at the entirety of our coastline, so not just those state granted lands. And then that was rolled into a citywide climate change hazard vulnerability assessment that considered those 4 primary climate hazards for us, which sea level rise, heat, wildfire, drought, and flooding. And what these vulnerability assessments really allow us to do is to know where to focus our resources. So we can focus our efforts on those more high risk assets, or the ones that would be the best candidates for implementation of adaptation strategies. Next slide. Just provide kind of context on where this all sits. Again, we have our Climate Action Plan Strategy 5 that notes the need for a standalone adaptation plan. Then we completed the vulnerability assessments, which are really these more technical informing documents that let us know where in the city we might be most vulnerable to various climate hazards. And then Climate Resilient SD, which is our comprehensive climate adaptation resiliency plan, is really going to both address those risks, but also plan for a more resilient San Diego. When we bring that forward, we'll also update the safety element of our general plan to include the plan. And then just something to note here is that stakeholder and community engagement throughout the process is really important to make sure that you're both educating the community, but that you're also really incorporating feedback from them and you're creating a plan that speaks to the community's needs. Next slide. So Climate Resilient SD, we are kicking off the planning process for it. There are 5 main goals for the plan: to connect and inform communities, maintain critical city services, support thriving natural environments, protect historic and tribal cultural resources, and build a resilient and equitable city. These main goals will really guide the planning process and both address, again, those risks from the vulnerability assessment, but also move beyond that to build a more resilient city. Next slide. To meet these goals, we are developing a suite of adaptation strategies that will address the risks and increase community capacity to respond and recover to different climate change hazards. Our adaptation strategies, I would say, can kind of be bucketed into 2 buckets. So our community focused strategies, these are ones that would really more so be community targeted and look to build stronger communities. These are things like expanding our urban tree canopy, developing community resilience hubs, continuing the Cool Zones program, or expanding the active transportation network. Next slide. The second bucket of strategies are our city services. So this really speaks to how do we maintain those critical city services. So these can be things like floodproofing critical infrastructure, conducting site assessments for specific identified assets, or continuing to diversify our water supply. Next slide. The city really sees our climate adaptation resiliency plan as an opportunity to really build those more resilient cities, more sustainable communities, more connected neighborhoods. There's a lot of co-benefits that can be realized through these adaptation strategies. So when you're implementing a strategy, you're not only mitigating that risk, but you might also be providing cleaner air to the community, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or protecting public health and safety. So it really allows us to improve the quality of life for our communities as we're addressing kind of the adaptation needs that we need to. Next slide. And then finally, I just wanted to expand a bit on our last goal, which was resilient and equitable city. Equity is a really critical component of our adaptation planning process. It's something that the city is prioritizing right now. We are defining that as prioritizing our city's communities of concern to ensure that investments and resources are prioritized for those with the greatest needs and vulnerability. Our climate equity index already identified what our communities of concern are for us. They're the ones with the least access to resources. So they're ones that we know are the most vulnerable. They will be hit the hardest by climate change with the fewest resources to respond. So we really want to make sure that as we're moving through the planning process, that those communities are continuously being brought into the process, but also being prioritized. Next slide. I should have one more. You can just go back. I'll keep talking. So some of the ways that the city has brought equity through the process really started with our vulnerability assessment. We wanted to make sure that we were including equity from the outset of this process. So the first way was through our asset inventory, making sure that we were identifying assets that would have an equity consequence if that asset were to be impacted. So a really good example of this is if a library that acts as a cooling zone is impacted and is no longer able to function as a cooling zone in an extreme heat event, community members that might rely upon that cooling zone because they don't have air conditioning and their community is just really warm during the extreme heat event, they would then be disproportionately impacted. Another way that we included equity in our planning was through the consequences screening. So after we did the vulnerability scoring of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, we had that consequence screening. And there we looked at, what was the consequence to these communities of concern? Was there a disproportionate impact to these communities if that asset were no longer available? So really throughout the vulnerability assessment, making sure that equity was something that we were considering and we were looking at, and that will only continue with our resiliency plan. So as we develop our plan, there's kind of a few things that we want to make sure that we're doing. One is that we're having really meaningful community engagement with our communities of concern, that their voices are really being heard, that we're making sure that they're able to come to the table, they're able to provide feedback, and that we're able to provide them the information they need to give us meaningful feedback. Another way that we're looking to do that is to build capacity, to empower those communities, and also to make sure that we're targeting funding and prioritizing funding in those communities of concern. And with that, I will hand it off to Kelly.
Thanks, Julia. So as Darby mentioned, my name is Kelly Bray. I'm the manager for the county's Climate Action Plan program. And what we do, we're seated within the Planning and Development Services division. So we're sort of a planning related program. We are currently overseeing the preparation and implementation of the county's current Climate Action Plan. While our 2018 Climate Action Plan really only touched briefly on adaptation and resilience and equity, we have a couple other efforts that I'd like to talk about today and introduce you to. So we're taking a bit of a different approach than the city of San Diego is. We're not creating a specific adaptation plan. More so we're managing these types of plans through our general plan elements updates. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. But first, I just want to make sure that everyone knows when we talk about the County of San Diego, in this planning context, we're talking about the unincorporated area. So that's the area that is not centered or located within the region's 18 incorporated cities. So as some of you may know, if you ever drive north or east, you will see lots of wide open space. It's sparsely populated and fairly rural in a lot of areas. So the climate change effects that we're seeing the most really are wildfire, drought, and extreme heat in the unincorporated area. And I would also say that, as we think about planning for adaptation and resilience and equity, we think that, these efforts are better, managed on a regional scale. And that's something that I want to think about, and I want you to think about as you think about your own personal work. Climate change is affecting everybody, right? So one of the points that this panel wanted to drive home was that, when you think about climate change, it's a global crisis, right? We're seeing it all over the world. We're seeing it particularly in our region. Of course, we have specific impacts, but it doesn't care about geographic boundaries. So really, while we recognize that the county, the ways that we can impact local solutions, we also want to make sure that we're collaborating with our communities, with other agencies, with SANDAG, with everybody who's interested, with CBOs, and everybody. So really, this is sort of the point of this panel, is to sort of introduce the topic and get you thinking, like, how is climate change affecting the work I'm doing? And what are my networks, what are my networks doing? And what are the solutions that I see in front of me to start educating the people that I'm around all the time? So just a little, setup for that context. Next slide. So as Julia discussed a bit, the state has already established legislation and guidance for general plan elements, which I mentioned is one of the things I'm going to talk to you about today. That's the way we're talking about this topic at the county and the planning department. But this is the general plan update, is something that we do frequently. It's one of the primary planning mechanisms that a lot of jurisdictions in California use to start thinking about how they want to see their communities grow, maintain, and develop, right? So as I mentioned, there's two elements right now that are really adjacent to this topic and cover this topic well, and that is the safety element and the environmental justice element. So the environmental justice element is going to be new to the county this year. It's the first time we've done this. The safety element is going to be an update, but both of them, I think, provide good opportunities to think about how to adapt to the effects of climate change and focus resources on our most vulnerable communities. We're also initiating an update to our current climate action plan. And so that's another opportunity for us to address these same topics and to sort of pull everything together in a package that makes sense as it's centered on climate change. Next slide. So just to give you a better idea of what the safety element is intended to do, I'm just going to walk through these really quickly. The safety element establishes policies that are intended to minimize the risk of personal injury, loss of life, property damage, and environmental damage associated with natural and human-caused hazards, as seen on this slide. Like I mentioned earlier, the effects that we're seeing primarily are wildfire, drought. We do see flooding and severe heat, right? So as part of the safety element, the county's including policies related to 3 new topic areas for this safety element update. Those policy topic areas are going to be climate change, vulnerability assessment, and adaptation and resiliency. So Julia went over a much more comprehensive slide on vulnerability assessment. It's the same sort of evaluation of where, what your infrastructure and your populations are and where you see the most sensitivity and risk. And so this is the part of the evaluation that the county is undertaking right now that will be, I think I should be on the next slide. Sorry, Darby. I moved on and you didn't. Thank you. So as I was mentioning, we are conducting the vulnerability assessment now. This is going to form, sort of one of the foundations, critical pieces for our safety element. And it's going to really focus on the sensitivity of key population groups and the community assets that are most potentially affected by the effects of climate change. And we're also going to consider our adaptive capacity to mitigate those impacts. So this is sort of where you evaluate, what types of infrastructure and populations do we have? What can we do to make those assets and those communities more resilient to the effects of climate change? Next slide. As I mentioned, we are also, once we determine what those vulnerabilities are, we will look at what we can do to make those communities and those assets more resilient. So we'll be looking to include goals and objectives and strategies to include within the safety element update as a way to plan for the worst effects of climate change. So we'll be relying on the California Adaptation Planning Guide. It's state guidance provided by the California Emergency Management Agency and the California Natural Resources Agency. That's going to serve as our best practices guide for our goals and policy setting exercise. You can see some of the example strategies here. The use of pervious pavement and landscaping, that helps mitigate flooding impacts from extreme precipitation events. We need to do a lot better job at education and outreach to homeowners on wildfire prevention. Wildfire is obviously one of the most significant risks that the county faced. We had one last night, and I think we're having one right now with the Santa Ana. So there's a lot that we're thinking about around wildfire. Some of it is, grid resiliency and figuring out how to get people power when SDG&E wants to shut it down. We're thinking about microgrid solutions there. How to prevent wildfires, how to promote fuel breaks. There's all kinds of different scenarios there that we are considering as policies. Use of cool pavement technology that helps to mitigate some of the effects of the extreme heat in some communities. And incorporating sea level rise effects in capital improvement plans is another type of policy and strategy that we can pursue. Although I will say that we don't have a whole lot of sea level rise issues in the county. We do have assets all over the county though. So those are something we would consider from a local government operations perspective. Next slide, Darby. So next we're talking about the environmental justice element. The purpose of this element is to identify the environmental justice communities within the unincorporated area and help really, identify those communities and learn what types of experiences they're having related to environmental pollution, extreme effects of climate change, any negative effects that are happening because of their particular vulnerabilities. So as part of the development of this element, the county is using both what they call the CalEnviroScreen 3.0 tool, as well as the Live Well communities that we've already identified to help sort of figure out who are our most vulnerable communities throughout the unincorporated area, and how can we get in front of helping them be less affected by the worst effects of environmental pollution and other hazards. So generally, I would say that the goals and policies that we'd be developing would try to achieve a reduction of the unique or compounded health risks that those communities are experiencing. We would like to have a much stronger engagement with those particular communities so that we can understand how to really promote stronger communities and direct resources to those communities. We also want to promote civic engagement so that we can be much more inclusive and having those communities in our conversations and figuring out, sort of what's the longer term planning scenario that we can identify to help create more resiliency in those communities. And also prioritize improvements, frankly, in those communities. So the process to help update both of these elements actually is ongoing. In fact, we just started our community engagement for both of these elements in the last couple of months. And that's going to be ongoing through spring. So at the end, I'm going to provide some contact information for the project managers. And I would urge you to reach out to them or go on the county's website and determine at what point you can get involved if you're interested in either of these two topics, because we're very much in the beginning stages of this and very interested to hear the community's perspective on these elements. Next slide. So the Climate Action Plan update is a project that is near and dear to my heart. It's my project. So we're just kicking it off. I'm really excited about it. We, in fact, over the next month or two, will start to really sort of provide media and press around it and help people understand what our time frame is for the development of the plan, and try to get people's interest piqued and get people engaged. What the intent of the Climate Action Plan update is to really bring together some of the things we're just talking about. While the Climate Action Plan itself is really a greenhouse mitigation plan, in other words, trying to mitigate the amount of greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere, it doesn't so much focus on adaptation and resiliency. It does have the flavor of those topics, right? And certainly this plan is going to have a much greater focus on equity and bringing in those vulnerable communities and helping us figure out how to prioritize our resources in those communities. So we will be looking strongly at outreach and engagement, like I mentioned just shortly, beginning in December, and actually it's a 2-year time frame. So we hope to be able to really engage a much broader audience, not just those folks who live in the unincorporated county, but frankly all San Diego County residents. We're hoping to really get everyone's ideas about what should be in a climate action plan and how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and how to communicate with the communities that may feel that they're not always at the table for planning efforts such as this. So I will provide my contact information at the end of this slide, but I also would say that if you have any interest in the county's climate action plan, just go ahead and Google that, County of San Diego Climate Action Plan. We have a really good website. We're actually in the process of updating it with a new project tab for this particular project, but it's pretty interactive. You can find all kinds of information about the 2018 plan already. So please sign up, introduce your email, and we'll keep you up to date about how you can get involved in that project as well. Next slide. So just a few final thoughts on regional collaboration. As a panel, we talked about, really the strength of the region of the County of San Diego is that we have so many agencies here, right? And we have so many really, bright and creative minds. We have a bunch of institutions as well as local governments and lots of planning staff, lots of environmental planners. And really this climate change thing it's consistently evolving, but I mean, we know where it's going, right? And so I think everyone is on board with the idea that we need to get going on this. We need to figure out what our strategies are. And if we can't stop it, we need to figure out how we're going to adapt, frankly, to it. So I know that generally, a lot of this audience tends to be a little more on the public health side. But like I said earlier, I urge you to think about, how you're seeing public health as a sector have impacts from climate change and where you're seeing those intersections. And in fact, if we have some time after the session, during Q&A, we were hoping to hear from you about, things that you're noting in your particular sector. But the other thing I would say is there's tons of resources that are local around us. SANDAG, which is the San Diego Association of Governments, the Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation at the Scripps Institute, the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative at USD that Darby's a part of and I'm a part of, local agencies, the City of San Diego, the County of San Diego, Carlsbad, all the major cities have a lot of work around this topic. So I would say, when you get some free time, just start reading about it. Not only is it fascinating, but it really connects you to the community and what's happening in this region around this topic. So, and lastly, I would just say, once you sort of feel like you have a pretty good hold on what it is, start talking to your network about it, right? I mean, we need to really kind of keep pushing the message and saying, look, this is happening. Let's get some motivation, behind community members so that it sort of gets out from behind the scenes of the academic and local agency perspective. And so that's where I'll just leave it, but hoping to hear from people that are on this call right now to help us understand, because we're planners, we're kind of coming from a particular expertise, but I'd like to hear from others to hear sort of how you feel the intersection is happening in your work.
Great, thanks Kelly, and thanks Julia. It looks like we have a pretty good group from the participant side. I am having a hard time getting to the panel because I'm sharing my screen. But yeah, I would also love to hear, from bouncing off of Kelly's question, if you could use maybe the Q&A, I think is what we have as a chat function of just kind of letting us know, where everyone is coming from, if you're comfortable sharing what organizations and maybe what kind of role or industry you're in. I know one of the exciting pieces about, having the opportunity to present at the Live Well San Diego is for us to, interact with folks that aren't necessarily within the planning sphere, but folks that are definitely, impacted by the planning sphere, as we all are. So if you're comfortable and willing to use the Q&A function to let us know who you are and where you're from, that would be really wonderful. And I think we have a few questions. Julia, it seems like you flagged one that you wanted to answer. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so everyone can kind of see us all at once, and I can also be useful.
There's a good question. Is disability community part of the list for the city's communities of concern? So there were 35 indicators that went into the Climate Equity Index, which then created the community of concern classification for that. One of them was disability. I can drop the link for the Climate Equity Index into the chat for everyone so you can look more into that. So it was one of the factors, but there are 35 factors. So there's a lot of different indicators that were used to determine that. We're also seeing multiple questions about a food purchasing component. I'll let Kelly speak to this as well, but for Climate Resilient SB, we really are still in the beginning stages. So Jordan, I believe, had answered a question on this as well, but it's certainly something that as we're building out the suite of adaptation strategies that we can look into. I would note, similar to the county, we are also in the process of updating our climate action plan and developing our environmental justice elements. So all of these different planning efforts really can speak to the concept of food security as well, and maybe building more localized food systems too.
Yeah, and I would just add, it looks like Barbara Gates has a very direct question about, is there a food purchasing, food purchasing component included in the CAP? And one of the reasons, so the answer is no. And one of the reasons that it's not is because in order to be a climate action plan measure, our particular climate action plan is actually a mitigation measure for our general plan. So it has pretty specific criteria about what our measure has to do and be in order to be counted, frankly, as a GHG reduction measure. One of those things that's really important is that, one, we need to have jurisdictional control over it, right? And two, we need to have an enforcement ability. So, a lot of the measures that we ended up with are things that are directly within the county's control. For example, we know that the county facilities, we can make them greener and use less energy by adding solar to our buildings, right? As you start to think about community measures, those get a little trickier because a lot of your options end up being more behavioral based changes, and those are trickier to enforce. So the food component, I'm not exactly sure where you were coming from with that, but in general, we don't have the ability to control what people purchase, and we don't have a current food purchasing program that I'm aware of that we could have set targets on for that. So if you have any additional specific information about that, go ahead and type it in for me.
So the question was about food purchasing of city programs. I am also similarly, I don't work in that space. I can certainly look into it, but I'm not familiar if we do have a food purchasing program for that. There's another question about the intersection of driving and climate action, which is a great one for the city. The majority of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. So that's really something that we're looking at as a key climate strategy. We actually recently just had a program move forward called Mobility Choices that looks at reducing our vehicle miles traveled, our VMT across the city, and how do we build out our active transportation infrastructure and provide supportive measures so that it's people want to use it, so that people want to, bike places or walk places or take transit infrastructure. It's not just having, the bike lane there, it's people feeling comfortable using it, it's it being an enjoyable facility to use. So I think that that's, a really critical, it's a really critical intersection. We need to address transportation in order to meet our climate action plan goals.
Yeah, I mean, the same goes for, I was reading what Barbara typed in, that's something I'll have to give some more thought to. It looks like they're saying for the food purchasing program that DC has a food purchasing program that's in existence. And so what they're going to do is commit to purchasing food that has a smaller carbon footprint, is what it looks like to me. So I think that's probably something that we could look at. I'm not aware of the County of San Diego purchasing food on a scale like that, but certainly I appreciate the suggestion, and I'll definitely add it to my list of measures to consider. That's a good one.
I think to just kind of build on that, so the school system is a separate system from the city, so we don't have
Right.
Control over what they purchase. But I think when we think about food systems as a whole, it's something that we can look at kind of in the holistic level as we're planning, because it is a really important facet of sustainability planning. It just depends on whether or not, as a jurisdiction, it's really something that we have control and impact over.
Yeah, we're actually looking more into the agricultural sector, so how we can implement some, either whether you incentivize or you regulate. There's two ways to get people to comply with what you're asking, right, in the agricultural sector. So we're considering different ways to reduce the amount of fertilizers, to maybe hopefully incentivize the farming community to use more carbon sequestration practices. There's a numerous amount of opportunities in the ag sector, so we're considering that. But I wanted to go back to the question about cars and climate change. So cars and climate change are inextricably linked, unfortunately. If you go to any jurisdiction and ask them what's the biggest piece of their inventory pie, it's usually vehicle miles traveled, right? So same thing for the County of San Diego. It's one of our biggest issues. It's one of the things we talk about every day, nearly all day, in every setting at this point, because we have a very sort of large amount of space, and we have developed in ways that continue to reinforce driving. So it's definitely something that we are looking into, very creative solutions. And you will see more discussion about that than probably any topic if you ever get involved in the county's climate action plan update process.
Thanks, Kelly and Julia. I think that's really great. I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. I think we have time for one more question. And there's one from Matthew here that, is there any data accumulation efforts or conversations with zoning to identify high pollution areas or heat zones based on redlining and housing segregation? I'm not sure if either of you or someone within your department has looked at that. I know that at the collaborative, we're working on a new project that's looking to integrate equity into planning and best practices, and some of those resources that we're looking into to kind of aggregate do touch on that a little bit. So hopefully, as we're moving through that project, we can start to provide some resources for our members that will address that issue. But it's definitely of concern as we move, both with climate and heat as well. But I figured that was our last question, and maybe we'll end on that one there if either of you have a response.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just add, I mean, it's not something that as of right now, we have a whole lot of information about. We're looking at developing a heat vulnerability index specifically, but we're really just in the beginning stages of scoping that. I think that's also something that we might be able to dive more into as we go forward with our EJ element.
Yeah, I would second that. I can't speak to whether we're doing any heat-based mapping. The high pollution areas, that's part of the Cal Enviroscreen analysis that's going to that's going to be illuminated for us. As far as the housing segregation and redlining, I don't have that much information about that. My sense of the county's unincorporated patterns, I don't think that we had a redlining situation out there because we don't have a lot of density. And as far as housing segregation, I'm not, I would have to give that some more thought. Unfortunately, I apologize, I don't have an answer for you there. But like I mentioned, on our slide earlier, feel free to reach out to me or any of the project managers that I noted if you would like to get involved. And we're happy to give you some more information and consider those topics a lot more. So just please do get involved.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kelly. I think that's a pretty good note to end on, unless Julie, you had any final thoughts there. But yeah, well, thank you all so much. Like Kelly mentioned, please, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our information and contact is within the Live Well portal. If you look in the chat, Julia also shared the link to the City of San Diego's Climate Equity Index. So if there's any interest in exploring that document, it's a really well put together document. I highly, encourage you to take a peek and get involved. Like Kelly said, climate change is something that's going to impact all of us, in all of our sectors in the work that we do. So thank you all so much for attending our session. And I think there's a way for you to ask us some questions via the portal after the session ends. So if there's anything lingering in your mind, in a couple of minutes or two, please feel free to reach out there or connect with us. But with that, I think we'll close. I don't have anything else to say besides stay safe and stay healthy, and do your best to enjoy the holidays with your loved ones the best you can. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.